You think of ancient Greece as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, marble statues, and the Olympic Games. But behind the shining faces of Athens and Sparta were sexual customs so disturbing that even today's desensitized society would be shocked to confront them. Before we continue, if you're interested in forgotten, dark chapters of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps us create more videos like this. Now let's get back to our main subject. The Greek understanding of sexuality was completely different from our modern perception. They had no concept of sexual orientation as we understand it today. Their entire system was built on a rigid hierarchy of sexual dominance. In any sexual relationship, your role, whether dominant, penetrating, or submissive, penetrated, determined your social status, legal rights, and political power. Being dominant symbolized masculinity, strength, and citizenship. Being submissive represented femininity, subjugation, and for an adult man, social death. This wasn't a philosophical theory. It was a practical social order. These roles dictated laws, careers, and the boundaries of honor, deciding who was a respected citizen and who was socially condemned. Sexual politics, power, pleasure, and the system of pederasty. The sexual politics of ancient Greece created a system where power and pleasure became inseparable. It normalized sexual exploitation to a degree that any modern civilization would find horrifying. Now we turn to one of the most common and most disturbing Greek practices, pederasty. This wasn't some hidden depravity. It was considered a fundamental part of elite education, glorified in art, celebrated in literature, and protected by law. Adult men, usually around 30, engaged in sexual relationships with boys as young as 12, and this was presented as a form of mentorship or moral education. These relationships followed strict social conventions that made them even more unsettling. The older man was called the Erastes, and the boy was the Eromenos. The Erastes would give gifts to the boy and openly display affection in public. These were not secret liaisons. Families often encouraged them, seeing them as opportunities for their son's social advancement. Child exploitation, under the banner of culture and tradition, the psyche, beauty of young boys, and the social status of adult men together created a market where child exploitation became a cultural tradition. Archaeological evidence shows that pottery, sculptures, and public buildings were decorated with scenes of adult men and adolescent boys in sexual acts. This wasn't hidden art. It was part of mainstream culture. It was so normalized that a boy who refused such relationships risked social disgrace. Refusal was seen as more shameful than submission, age and power, sex as education. This system was not random. It was deliberately structured. Boys were considered sexually acceptable once they reached puberty, around ages 12 to 14, and the relationship typically ended when facial hair began to grow, around 18 to 20. But this cutoff wasn't about protection. It was about preserving the hierarchy of power. Once the boy began to look like a man, continuing the relationship would threaten the older man's dominance, so the affair would end not for the boy's safety, but for the man's social preservation. Sex as a tool of education. These relationships were so integral that they were treated as part of the educational process. Adult men claimed they were teaching boys politics, philosophy, and social manners, but sexual intimacy was seen as essential. The Greeks believed that physical closeness forged emotional bonds that enhanced learning and character development. Some modern scholars argue that these relationships were primarily emotional, but evidence from the era says otherwise. Legal texts documented the rules of such relationships. Medical writings described their physical aspects, and literature openly celebrated them. The evidence is too extensive to deny. Sparta's militarized society took these practices even further. The famous Spartan training system, the agoge, began at age 7. Boys were separated from their families and placed in environments where older soldiers acted as mentors, trainers, and often sexual partners. Refusing to participate could mean being excluded from military life altogether. Spartan warriors were expected to form deep emotional and physical bonds with their trainees, believing it would inspire loyalty and bravery on the battlefield. But no one considered what psychological scars this system inflicted on the boys. The society valued military efficiency over human dignity. In ancient Greece, marriage had nothing to do with love or mutual consent. It was a business transaction in which fathers sold their daughters to husbands who could afford them. The age gap in marriages was so significant that it was truly astonishing. Men typically married in their 30s, while girls were married off as early as 12 or 13. These were not partnerships based on equality, but rather arrangements in which adult men gained legal ownership of children. The wedding night often involved what we would today recognize as statutory rape, which was considered the completion of a legitimate marriage. Greek laws enforced the inferior status of women with brutal precision. A wife had no right to own property, conduct business, or make legal decisions. She existed entirely under her husband's authority, and if he chose to abuse that power, there was no recourse for her. Domestic violence was not merely tolerated, it was considered the husband's right and responsibility to maintain order in the household. The isolation of women in Greek cities had reached extreme levels. Respectable women were confined to their homes, forbidden from participating in public life or social gatherings. They could not attend theatre performances, political assemblies, or religious festivals that included men. Their world shrank to the domestic sphere, where their sole purpose was to produce legitimate heirs and manage household affairs. Yet even within marriage, women faced further humiliations, revealing the depths of Greek misogyny. Husbands routinely maintained relationships with male lovers, female slaves, and prostitutes. These affairs were not hidden or shameful. They were seen as normal male behavior, which wives were expected to accept without complaint. The sexual double standard in Greek society was absolute and merciless. A wife's adultery was punishable by death or permanent exile, while a husband's infidelity was considered a normal male behavior. Women who expressed jealousy or resentment were viewed as unreasonable and potentially dangerous to social stability. This system trapped women in marriages where they had no rights, no voice and no escape. In ancient Greece, religious prostitution added another horrifying layer to the lives of women. In Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite housed over 1,000 sacred prostitutes, donated by families as religious offerings. These women were not volunteers serving a divine calling, but human sacrifices exploited sexually under the control of economic and religious systems. This practice was religiously sanctioned, making resistance not just difficult but blasphemous. Families dedicated their daughters to temple service, knowing that they would spend their lives providing sexual services to male worshippers. The religious framework provided a moral justification for what amounted to organized sexual slavery. The economic aspect of sacred prostitution reveals its true nature. Temples generated substantial revenue from these services, funding construction projects and supporting the religious elite. The women themselves saw none of this profit. They became valuable property, generating income for institutions that owned them completely. Their bodies were commodified as religious goods, sanctifying sexual exploitation. Archaeological evidence makes it clear that these operations were on an industrial scale. Hundreds of women had designated living quarters, elaborate bathing facilities, and administrative offices to manage the business. These weren't small religious practices. They were major economic enterprises built on systematic sexual abuse, disguised as divine service. The selection of temple prostitutes followed familiar patterns of exploitation. Young girls were chosen for their physical beauty and their families' desperation. Poor families saw temple service as their daughter's only option for survival, while wealthy families used it to fulfill religious obligations without sacrificing their own comfort. In ancient Greece, psychological manipulation extended beyond individual relationships into systematic cultural programming. These girls entered temple service believing they were chosen by the gods, chosen for a sacred purpose. Their religious indoctrination was so thorough that many began to see their exploitation as a sacred duty, unable to recognize the abuse, even as it destroyed their lives. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Greek sexuality was the normalization of erotic magic, designed to control and manipulate unwilling partners. Ancient Greeks practiced love spells with the same casual acceptance they showed for any other form of commerce. These weren't harmless romantic gestures, they were calculated attempts to override consent through supernatural coercion. The magical practices revealed the depth of Greek attitudes towards sexual autonomy. Men regularly used spells to compel specific women to desire them, viewing magical coercion as perfectly acceptable when physical force might be inconvenient. The spells themselves involved elaborate rituals, including burning effigies, reciting incantations, and burying cursed objects near the intended victim's home. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered thousands of cursed tablets containing explicit sexual demands. These weren't abstract wishes for love or affection. They were detailed instructions to supernatural forces commanding specific sexual acts from named individuals. These tablets used the language of rage and lust, designed to drive women mad with desire, forcing them to abandon their families and seek out the spellcaster. The language used in these magical texts reveals the predatory mindset behind them. Women weren't seen as autonomous beings capable of choice. They were viewed as conquerable objects, to be dominated by whatever means proved effective. These spells presented female sexuality as territory to be claimed, rather than intimacy to be shared between consenting partners. Professional practitioners offered specialized services for different types of sexual coercion. Some focused on seducing unwilling partners, while others specialized in breaking up existing relationships to create romantic opportunities. The most disturbing category involves spells designed to make women sexually insatiable, transforming them into objects of pure lust, incapable of rational thought. The effectiveness of these practices mattered less than their widespread acceptance. Greek society tolerated magical sexual coercion because it reflected broader attitudes about male entitlement and female autonomy. If a woman could be compelled through physical force, economic pressure, or social manipulation, magical coercion seemed equally legitimate. Even more horrifying were the documented practices of zoophilia that appeared throughout Greek literature and historical accounts. While often attributed to other cultures, the frequency of references and mythological themes suggests these practices were familiar concepts in Greek society. Their literature didn't condemn such acts as perverse. Instead, they were treated as exotic curiosities or divine mysteries. The mythological framework provided justification for behaviors that violated every natural boundary. Stories of gods transforming into animals to seduce mortals weren't just entertainment. They were cultural templates that normalized bestial practices by giving them divine precedent. Zeus becoming a bull to rape Europa wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a celebrated myth, performed in theaters and depicted in art. The medical and philosophical writings of the period discussed these practices with clinical detachment that's more disturbing than outright condemnation. Greek physicians wrote about treating injuries resulting from animal contact. Philosophers debated whether such acts violated natural law or represented alternative expressions of human desire. The casual academic approach reveals a society where nothing was considered too extreme to discuss or practice. Even the concept of consent, limited as it was in Greek society, completely disappeared when it came to slaves and foreigners. These populations existed entirely outside legal protection, available for any form of sexual exploitation their owners desired. The systematic abuse of enslaved people reached levels that make plantation slavery look restrained by comparison. Greek households routinely maintained slaves specifically for sexual purposes. These weren't individuals who happened to be attractive. They were human beings purchased and bred for their sexual utility. Children born from these arrangements became property of the household, continuing the cycle of exploitation into the next generation. Certainly. Here's the English translation of the provided text. In ancient Greece, the system of sexual exploitation was built on a comprehensive and ruthless legal foundation. Slaves had no right to refuse sexual demands from their masters or anyone their masters designated. If slaves resisted this exploitation, they were punished with torture or death. Even testimony about sexual abuse was inadmissible in court because slaves could not legally accuse citizens of wrongdoing. The scale of this exploitation becomes clear when examining household inventories from wealthy Greek families. Hundreds of slaves were categorized for various purposes, including explicit sexual purposes. These records were not secret. They were official documents filed with local authorities for tax and insurance purposes. The system operated openly because it was not only legal, but also socially acceptable. When we fully understand these aspects of sexual exploitation in ancient Greece, a clear pattern emerges. Every action we have seen operates on a fundamental principle: might makes right. Whether targeting children, women, slaves, or even animals, Greek sexual culture was built on the systematic exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. The philosophical justifications for this exploitation revealed the true purpose of systemic oppression. They viewed child abuse as education, sexual slavery as religion, and magical coercion as romance, transforming horrific crimes into cultural virtues. The victims could not resist what society celebrated as beneficial to them. This was not a society struggling with moral questions about sexuality. It was a society that answered those questions by deciding that the powerful had unlimited rights over the weak. The democracy that gave political voice to male citizens operated alongside systems that silenced everyone else through sexual subjugation. The legacy of these practices echoes through history in ways most people never recognize. The philosophical frameworks that justified Greek sexual exploitation influenced Roman law, Christian theology, and Western legal traditions. The same arguments used to defend pederasty and sexual slavery appear in modified forms throughout subsequent civilizations' understanding. This history is important because it shows how advanced societies can normalize horrific practices through cultural conditioning and institutional support. The ancient Greeks were not primitive, barbarians acting on savage impulses. They were educated, philosophical people who created systematic justifications for behaviors they knew caused suffering. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they succeeded in presenting their civilization as the birthplace of reason, democracy, and human dignity. For thousands of years, scholars have studied Greek philosophy while ignoring Greek sexual practices, preserving the myths while burying the reality. The marble statues and democratic ideals survived, but the voices of the victims were silenced. The next time you see ancient Greece portrayed as a golden age of human achievement, remember the children forced into sexual relationships with their teachers, the women treated as breeding stock, the slaves who existed solely for their owners' pleasure, and the magical practices designed to override human consent. Behind every marble column stood a system built on sexual exploitation so comprehensive that it makes modern atrocities look limited by comparison. This is the real legacy of ancient Greece that history books conveniently forget to mention.